I don't want to set the world on fire.
Arizona. Quiet, peaceful, sleepy Arizona. A nice place to escape the cold eastern winter now that the Indian Wars are over. But you wouldn't want to live there. Hot as a stove in the summer. Of course, it's a dry heat. No, you wouldn't want to live there, at least not until something comes along to wake the place up. December 7th, 1941, the day that would live in infamy, and a most significant day for the folks on the Sonoran Desert. The sinking of the battleship USS Arizona started a chain of events that would change this state forever. But our story begins 30 years earlier, around 1910. Geronimo had just died. Mary Pickford was earning $40 a week making moving pictures, and doctors were just beginning to use something called the X-ray. Meanwhile, back home, the big argument was about statehood, and Arizonans were against it, at least against the idea that we come in as part of New Mexico, and the excuses in Congress were wearing thin.
The motivations here were along racial and religious lines, along with political lines. They felt we had too much of a Hispanic population. They felt we had too many polygamist Mormons, and we had too many Democrats. That's about what it boiled down to.
Finally, Arizona statehood was approved by the Congress, but President Taft vetoed the bill. He opposed the parts of our Constitution that allowed for initiative petitions and the removal of judges, so we took those provisions out, then put them back in later. February 14, 1912, Valentine's Day, President William Howard Taft signed the bill making Arizona the 48th state. Back in Phoenix, future Governor and U.S. Senator Paul Fannin had just turned 5 years of age.
We lived at 55 Westmoreland, just a short distance off of Central Avenue, and I can remember that we had to go down to the parade and go down to, they had a little celebration in a square that was in the central part of Phoenix, and that's about all I can remember. I just remember that my dad and mother took us all down to witness that, with the celebration.
You didn't take notes on Governor Hunt's speech? Or...
No, I didn't take any notes, and in fact I didn't even know who was speaking.
Well, it's not surprising that a 5-year-old Paul Fannin didn't take any notes that day. To a kid, it would have been just a parade and some speeches. But to the adult citizens, it was a Valentine they had waited years, since 1863, to receive. Hello, my name is Bill McCune, and I have the privilege of being your host as we explore the spirit of Arizona from statehood forward. We hope to instill in you a pride and an appreciation of the rich history of our state. Those first years after statehood saw some momentous events around the world. There was the sinking of the Titanic. Joe Dawson won the Indy 500 going 78 miles per hour. Woodrow Wilson became the president. The Panama Canal was officially opened, and Charlie Chaplin made his first movie. In Arizona, filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille came to Flagstaff to start a movie colony, but it snowed that day, so he started Hollywood instead. In politics, Arizona gave women the right to vote in 1912, 8 years before it was approved nationally. In 1914, Rachel Berry of St. John's became the first American woman to be elected to a state House of Representatives. Our first 2 U.S. senators were colorful. Marcus Aurelius Smith was reportedly viewed as quite a sex symbol in his day. And Henry Fountain Ashurst was known as the silver-tongued orator of the Colorado. Also elected as our first congressman was a man who ultimately would serve in Washington for 58 years, longer than any other American.
There's a long, long trail winding into the land of my dreams.
Carl Hayden was born in 1877 at Hayden's Ferry, Arizona. That's Tempe today. In 1911, he was elected sheriff of Maricopa County and then went to Congress in 1912. He moved to the Senate in 1927. In time, he was chairman of the powerful Senate Appropriations Committee and ultimately became President pro tem of the U.S. Senate, which made him third in line of succession to the presidency.
Accomplished just watershed legislation in behalf of Arizona. Power far beyond his political base, and largely out of character, strength, persistence, a man of just compelling presence, especially during his middle years.
Carl Hayden, probably the father of our water resources in the state, certainly of the Central Arizona Project, and the Marshall Plan. Carl Hayden was one of the great statesmen of America, not just of Arizona, and we miss him.
In 1911, Roosevelt Dam started generating electricity. Teddy Roosevelt himself came out for the dedication. But still, for most people, daily life was flavored with the taste of what we today might think of as a camping trip.
The iceman came down the alley, brought in the 50 or 100-pound chunks of ice and put it in the ice box, and the water dripped through into a pan under the ice box, and every once in a while you had to empty the pan or it would run over.
But I recall very well that there weren't any washing machines when I was a young man in that sense. They had a tub, and you put the fire and then get the water boiling and get a stick and stir it up, etc., and that takes care of the laundry. You can visualize what job Mother had with 14 children and washing clothes that way.
We can laugh at all the clouds. They missed us by a mile. So pack up your troubles in your kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
And I recall that there was a man in the center of the park, in the bandstand, and the city was the first governor of Arizona, George W.P. Hunt. They had a band going, and I got close to the park and looked at this man. He must have weighed about 300 pounds, had a very big mustache, and not a sign of hair on his head, totally bald, and he had this mustache, and I looked at him, and he looked to me like actually like a walrus in every sense of the word.
It's often said that young, penniless George W.P. Hunt arrived in Globe, Arizona Territory, riding a mule. He worked as a waiter, a miner, and a grocery clerk. Eventually, he became fairly wealthy in the mercantile business. Along the way, he turned his attention to politics and won various elections to the Territorial House and Senate, then known as the Council, and as Gila County Treasurer. In 1904, he became president of the council, and in 1910, the president of the Constitutional Convention. And in the first election of state office holders, he was elected governor.
That one man dominated Arizona's history for nearly 50 years. He was full of juice and energy and political instincts. He was a conniver, a speaker, an organizer. And I think he left behind him in Globe a sort of sense that anything's possible. Here's this guy who came in the late 19th century with his belongings on a mule, settled in Globe, and from that base became governor of Arizona.
In all, Governor George W.P. Hunt served 7 non-consecutive 2-year terms over a 21-year period from 1912 to 1933. He was progressive, popular with the unions. He believed the Colorado River water was Arizona's and shouldn't be shared with anyone, especially California. All in all, Hunt was a colorful character. In 1916, he and Republican Tom Campbell both claimed victory. Campbell assumed the office for almost a year until the courts gave it back to George W.P. Hunt, who finished the term. But Campbell was elected on his own in 1919 and again in 1921. During his terms, he urged reforms in state budgeting procedures, but had little success. In 1920, Campbell was prominently mentioned as a vice presidential running mate for Warren G. Harding, but he didn't get it. Of course, had he become vice president, it would have changed American history, as President Harding died in office. President Thomas Edward Campbell, born at Fort Whipple, Arizona. It might have been. If Arizona was a peaceful place during those early years, its southern neighbor was not. Mexico had been fighting a civil war since 1910. Arizonans would flock to the border to watch the action. During a 2-month siege of Naco, 54 Americans were hit by stray bullets. Initially, Americans were perhaps sympathetic with revolutionary Pancho Villa, but officially neutral. Then in 1915, President Wilson gave his support and direct military assistance to General Carranza and the Federales. Angered by the U.S. involvement, Pancho Villa attacked Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17 American soldiers.
And General John Pershing was sent into Mexico on a punitive expedition to capture Pancho Villa. There were rumors in Arizona during those times that Villa was going to make a raid into Arizona, and he was going to blow up Roosevelt Dam, and he was going to rob the banks in Phoenix. These were mostly rumors, but there was one bank in town that was issuing out rifles and ammunition to the local citizens just in case Villa showed up, and the local Red Cross was training women to handle the wounded. But Villa never arrived, and Roosevelt Dam wasn't blown up, and none of the banks were robbed by the Villistas. Pershing never did catch Pancho Villa. He kept him on the run, and but Villa became a Robin Hood because he was escaping the old gringos from the north and making them look like fools, chasing him across the plains and the deserts of Mexico.
Pancho Villa's virtues were debated for years to come. Recently, when a statue of Villa was unveiled in Tucson, it started the arguments all over again. We'll be back in a moment with World War I. This region had historically been a battleground. There was the Mexican War, the gunslingers, Pancho Villa, and of course all the Indian Wars. So when World War I came along, the natural inclination in Arizona was to join the fight. The only difference was that the battles would be fought in someone else's backyard. Actually, if the German strategists planning World War I had had their way, it would have been fought in Arizona.
Well, the Zimmerman note, for example, played a big role. This was a note that was intercepted by the British intelligence, and it exposed a plan by the Germans to award this land back to Mexico if the Mexicans would keep things stirred up along the border so that they'd keep the United States busy and out of the war in Europe. And when the Southwesterners heard about this, of course, they were all for going off and whipping the Germans. And this was a great, if it was for propaganda purposes, it really paid off handsomely for the British, because the Americans out in this part of the country were volunteering in droves now to go fight.
And each citizen contributed in his own way. In Tempe, Dr. Benjamin Moore made a policy of forgiving all medical bills owed by boys going off to the war. It's no wonder he was later elected governor.
So the Arizonans were, obviously being a new state, they wanted to show their patriotism, and they enrolled in great numbers. And the 158 Infantry, the Arizona National Guard, won high marks for their deeds in World War I, and afterwards, when President Wilson went back for the peace talks in Paris, they were his color guard.
That war also had a dramatic and lasting impact on two Arizona industries.
It's really kind of amazing how little copper was used, how little was demanded at the turn of the century. But with the oncoming of World War I, the great demand for automotive radiators and tank materials and shell casings and cartridges for the weapons, that increased by hundreds of thousands of metric tons. And Arizona was just virtually within a decade turned into the nation's #1 copper producer.
Long staple Pima cotton was the other demand. At $1.25 per pound, some farmers paid off their mortgages with a single crop. Arizona had its heroes. Frank Luke Jr. won the Congressional Medal of Honor. During his 17 days at the front, he destroyed 14 heavily guarded observation balloons and shot down 4 enemy aircraft. In a 10-minute period on his final day, he knocked out 3 balloons and 2 planes before being shot down himself. Surviving the crash, he was killed on the ground, shooting it out with German troops. Arizona had 2 other flying heroes in that war. Lieutenant Ralph O'Neill of Nogales and Major Reed Chambers of Fort Huachuca were air aces, having shot down 5 and 7 enemy airplanes respectively. In all, some 321 Arizonans died in World War I. The first Arizonan, and indeed the first Native American from any state to be killed, was Matthew Wan, a Pima Indian from Sacaton. Marine Corporal John Henry Pruitt of the Verde Valley was a hero who has received little or no attention from his state. His unit was pinned down by a German company that was supported by a machine gun position. Single-handed, Pruitt made a frontal assault on the enemy. An hour later, he returned, carrying the enemy machine gun to cover his 40 German prisoners. Ironically, he was killed on a later day by a stray German shell. John Henry Pruitt was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor not once but twice, from the Army and from the Marine Corps.
Look for the silver lining whenever clouds.
Jeff Power had immigrated from Germany and lived with his sons, Tom and John, in a cabin deep in the Galuro Mountains of southern Arizona. When it was discovered that the boys had not registered for the military draft, a group of lawmen trekked in at night and surrounded their cabin.
When the old man, the father, was shot down in the doorway of the cabin, a war took place. And when the casualties were all counted, 3 lawmen were dead outside of the cabin. And the 2 Power brothers were both wounded, and they took up flight. It is said that that was the greatest manhunt in Arizona's history. That something like 2,500 troops took part in the chase, even into Mexico.
When the boys were captured, they were paraded before the public in chains. A jury quickly convicted them, and because there was no death penalty at the time, they were sentenced to life in prison.
The father had been killed with his arms in the air. Certain muscles here in his chest lined up with a bullet hole only when his arms were above his head.
That didn't carry weight at the original trial.
No, I don't think that was even heard. The original trial was a railroad. They scarcely had the proceedings would be thrown out by any modern review.
In 1960, it was Don Dedera, then a daily columnist for the Arizona Republic, who took the Power brothers' story to the public. In circumstances made less emotional by the passage of time, it seemed more likely that the boys had in fact fired in self-defense. Tom and John Power went free after 42 and a half years in prison.
They were gentle cowboys, men of the land, and they never changed.
World War I ended November 11, 1918. But there would be one more deadly threat before the decade ended. An epidemic of Spanish flu claimed 500,000 lives nationally. So contagious was this bug that public events were prohibited, schools were closed. Folks on the street in Tucson and Phoenix were required to wear white gauze flu masks, and you just didn't shake hands with anyone. Many Arizona lives were lost until early in 1919, when the virus suddenly abandoned its human targets and decimated the state's poultry and swine industries. Our state's first deadly decade of statehood came to an end. The Roaring '20s really didn't roar that loud in Arizona, but we were moving into the modern world. The state population exceeded 350,000, and the capital city boasted 9,300 telephones. Arizona was on the move.
The development years, the beginning of technology, the first radio stations, for example, the better communications, the building of roads, which Hunt, incidentally, was a fanatic about, is good roads.
Of course, in a growing state, business and recreation depended on transportation, and in Arizona, it was somewhat primitive. There were about 35,000 automobiles, but less than 300 miles of paved road.
If you took a trip to Prescott or to Flagstaff, as I remember, it was an all-day drive from Phoenix to Prescott, and this would have been in the early and mid 1920s, and then another day from Prescott to Flagstaff. And this would be starting out 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and you'd arrive in Prescott just about dark.
But slow travel over rugged roads was only one of the problems.
It was a cul-de-sac. It scarcely had any transcontinental transportation facilities at all, aside from the railroads. The transcontinental highway was the Apache Trail that came down past Roosevelt Dam, and you can imagine what it was to bring freight down that road. The freight rates were very unfair to Arizona. They were loaded up so that bringing things in, taking things out was inordinately expensive.
A state highway department had been established, and one of its best-known projects was a magazine. More than any other medium, it has been the articles and photographs of Arizona highways that have given us an awareness and appreciation of the state's 16 Indian nations. The smallest of these is the 250-member Paiute tribe, the largest, the Navajo, numbering 200,000. The Navajo Nation organized its first modern tribal government in 1923 under the leadership of Chief, then tribal chairman, Henry Chi Dodge. Over the years, all Native American nations have adopted democratic government, although they were not granted the right to vote in Arizona state elections until 1948. Around 1922, Arizona started buzzing. In Phoenix, it was radio station KFAD, soon followed by KFCB. Today, they are KTAR and KOY. In Tucson, it was KTUC in 1926, followed by KVOA, the Voice of Arizona, in 1929. Radio stations are million-dollar deals today, but 70 years ago, they were just sideshows for other businesses.
The Electrical Equipment Company had gone down to protest to Dodge, MacArthur Brothers, who first started KFAD. They were the Dodge dealers. And they said, you don't run your station long enough, we can't sell radios. So they said, we'll just give you the station. So they gave them the station, and they ran it long enough to sell radios.
Politics aside, Jack Williams was a broadcaster.
Oh, we had lots of talent. We thought when you played a record that you were committing a sin. We had an organ in the studio, and we had everything. We went great guns. We even had a soap opera that was written by Orrin Arnold.
In the late 1940s, one of the in-studio talents was a student from Arizona State named Steve Allen.
He had a marvelous sense of humor, and we had a fellow named Wendell Noble who could sing, and together they worked up a program called Fun Time, which they quipped back and forth, sang back and forth, sometimes in harmony, and they went to the coast with it and went on mutual coast to coast.
As years went by, radio became a part of daily life, and Arizonans contributed to the industry. Local theater operator Dwight "Red" Harkins owned radio KTYL, and in 1950 started our first FM station. Then, working on his own in a small lab above a theater, he invented FM stereo. As Red Harkins traveled state to state selling and installing the technology, he never got around to applying for a patent. In the 1920s, some new technology required user courage.
I didn't get down to Tucson. I remember once going down there, I can't remember the purpose. I went down on a Ford tri-motor plane and came back on it, and I was pretty scared because it's my first major plane trip, and I pushed a button and they changed the props just then. And I thought, I've sure fixed this thing. We're going down right now. But we didn't.
A flight from Los Angeles to Phoenix one way cost $32.50 and took several hours, including a fuel stop at Desert Center, California. Municipalities were rushing to develop airports. In 1927, Tucson dedicated the largest airport in the United States. 20,000 citizens watched Charles A. Lindbergh himself start the first beacon. Phoenix pilots sometimes missed the strip at 59th Avenue and McDowell and landed on the ballpark at Central and Mojave. In 1929, Sky Harbor was dedicated near its present site. It was known by some as the farm, as pilots had to scare the cows off the field before they could land. Tourism in Arizona centered around Tucson first. An 1895 attraction was the Mountain View Hotel, a resort near Oracle. One of Tucson's finest resorts, the Arizona Inn, was opened by Isabella Greenway. She was Arizona's only woman elected to Congress. Wickenburg was known as the Dude Ranch capital. Castle Hot Springs near Wickenburg was an early health resort. And Castle Hot Springs spawned another resort.
There was a woman named Grandma Champy. And Grandma Champy took the overflow from the hot springs at Castle Hot Springs and boarded Easterners for $1 a day, and that included the horse.
If there was an evolution in Arizona tourism, it has been a shift from the corral to the golf course. The Ingleside Inn, opened in 1909, was at the site of the present-day Arizona Country Club in northeast Phoenix. And the Arizona Biltmore, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, was established in 1929. Just up the hill is what was the old Wrigley Mansion. Not a resort, but the home of what you might call an early, serious winter visitor. And this comment about prohibition, as it was ignored in Arizona.
There were people who wanted the stuff, and there were people who were willing to get it, and there were people who delivered it. And then in little towns like Payson, oh my, I mean, Bootleg Alley today is the official name of a little side street that goes off Main Street and eventually led down into American Gulch, where there were some obliging ranchers who did not raise cows.
Arizona ended the 1920s with a new governor, John C. Phillips, a Republican who was elected before the great stock market crash. As governor, he created the Fish and Game Commission, and he gave his inaugural address in only 6 minutes. But the most lasting story about John C. Phillips was his own claim to being the ugliest man in Arizona. When an angry citizen accused him of being a two-faced so-and-so, Governor Phillips replied, "Madam, if I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" We'll be back after these messages. During the 1930s, there was only one major story in the world, the Great Depression. The state of Arizona was $7.5 million in debt, and 19,000 citizens were on relief. In 1932, Governor Hunt was back again. Then 2 years later, in 1934, he lost in the primary to another Democrat, Dr. Benjamin Moore. This marked the end of George W.P. Hunt's long career. He died a few months later. And an interesting footnote, the general election campaign of 1934, Dr. Moore's victory over Republican J.C. Kinney took a campaign budget of $75.80. But in state government, fiscal problems were just a bit more challenging. To balance the state budget, we adopted sales, income, and luxury taxes, and cut expenses by $4.5 million.
It really didn't come to Arizona till into the early 30s. We didn't really feel it here, but once it hit like a thunderbolt. The bottom dropped out of the copper market, and it dropped out of the cotton market, and mines were shutting down, which affected entire communities.
At one time, he owned about where the old depot was built, and a whole block at the 3rd Street and Monroe and things like that. But that all went to the wayside when the Depression came.
People got the feeling we didn't belong there, that go back to Mexico because we have a depression, the jobs are ours, and you're competing with us, and therefore America for Americans. That's the type of exposure I went through during the Depression times.
The state of Arizona actually lost population. Some 50,000 people left during the Depression years. Economic hard times saw the creation of many federal programs. One with lasting value for Arizona was the CCC.
The Civilian Conservation Corps, and hundreds and thousands of young men and a few women were picked up out of the slums and the economically depressed areas of the South and the East, and put to work for $1 a day, building trails. They built trails in the Grand Canyon. They put in most of the facilities in South Mountain Park in Phoenix. Most of the 30s were occupied. Arizona was occupied by the CCC boys.
Brother, can you spare a dime? Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide open...
The Depression took its toll in all areas of the economy. Cattle production was down because so many Americans could not afford to buy beef. Ranching and the old frontier cowboy were changing. Many had lived their lives virtually alone, out on the range under a code of freedom and independence, a lifestyle that was near an end. Ranching today might involve computers, helicopters, and genetic engineering, but the spirit of the cowboy will be a part of Arizona forever.
I've told every little star just how sweet I think you are. Why?
American newspapers had become fairly modern institutions by 1931, and from this duplex, Phoenix provided the most sensational story.
This was a story that had money, it had power, it had sex, it had murder. It was just every reporter's dream.
Young, attractive, separated Winnie Ruth Judd was convicted of murdering 2 female friends, putting the dismembered bodies in a trunk.
California, here I come.
And shipping them to Los Angeles by train. A youthful Jack Williams worked part-time at the train depot.
I loaded that body on the train, that whole trunk, both the trunks, there were 2 trunks involved, and put them on the train. You pulled up to the baggage car, pushed the trunk on, and then it wasn't until it got to Los Angeles that blood began to seep out of it.
Might as well confess. If I don't, they guess.
The grisly discovery and Mrs. Judd's arrest brought hundreds of reporters to Phoenix. Privately, she claimed self-defense, hinting that a locally prominent young man was involved and that he could clear her. But the court plea was insanity. She never testified. She was convicted and sentenced to hang. Still, on the record, she would not talk. 72 hours before the execution, Winnie Ruth was judged insane and sent to the state mental hospital. During the next 35 years, she escaped no less than 7 times, once for 6 years. Finally, in 1971, she was released to California. Ironically, the release was signed by Governor Jack Williams, who 40 years earlier had loaded the bodies on the train. As late as 1990, Winnie Ruth Judd was still alive and has never told her story. Disputes over the Colorado River seemed endless. Governor Benjamin Moore had hoped to stop California from building Parker Dam, so he sent the National Guard, machine guns and all, to the riverbank to intimidate the construction workers. A borrowed steamboat was supposed to help the cause.
They got hung up in some cables in the construction project, and much to the chagrin and dismay of the Arizona National Guard, they had to be rescued by the arch enemy, the Californians. It made the papers all over the country about the Arizona Navy getting sunk in the Colorado, and a few days later the Supreme Court ordered Governor Moore to bring the troops home. So thus ended the war with California in 1932.
Popular Governor Benjamin Moore served for 2 terms, but lost in the 1936 Democratic primary. He died 3 months after leaving office. The new governor was former Judge Raul Stanford. Hit with the full force of the Depression, he felt he could please no one. When homeless families set up housekeeping on his front lawn, he announced he would not seek re-election. Raul Stanford later served a long and distinguished career on the state's Supreme Court. Stanford was replaced by another one-term governor, Robert T. Jones. Jones had become the substitute candidate when the Democratic nominee was killed in a plane crash. As governor, he made reforms at the state hospital and equipped the National Guard for the war he saw coming. Well, of course, Robert Jones was right. War came on December 7, 1941. And the sinking of the battleship USS Arizona made our name a household word. Arizona had been only rather a vague notion to most Americans. Now the ship, bearing its name with 1,102 war dead entombed, had become a symbol for the just cause of our war efforts against Japan and Germany.
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me.
As in the First World War, copper mines and cotton farmers were busy. And like the rest of America, industrial jobs were plentiful. It was a terrible price to pay, but the Great Depression was in fact over. This war would be won with airplanes, and that required bases where tens of thousands of flyers could be trained. Arizona had the right stuff, the weather. And in short order, we saw the construction of 6 major pilot training bases and various ground troop encampments. Most of General Patton's armies trained here. During the course of the war, some 150,000 military personnel were at these bases. This included 60,000 pilots from the U.S., Britain, China, and other Allied countries.
As I remember, there was a lot of activity, more than what we had ever seen before when I came home on furlough. But keep in mind, I was 21 years old then, and economic indicators didn't mean a whole lot to me, other than could I buy a beer?
Arizona's National Guard, the 158th Bushmasters, were sent to secure the Panama Canal. A year later, they were in the thick of the fighting in New Guinea, and in January 1945 were among the units helping General Douglas MacArthur recapture the Philippines. Arizona had only one Medal of Honor winner in World War II. His name was Sylvester Herrera. In March 1945, Herrera's unit was pinned down by German machine guns. Twice the Army PFC made a one-man assault on the enemy position. The first time he took 8 prisoners. During his second offensive, he stepped on a landmine that literally blew off both his feet. Still alone, he continued to press the attack that allowed reinforcements to come through.
You must remember this, a kiss is still a kiss.
Then there was the Marine Corps' Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Bapchul, Arizona. At Iwo Jima, Hayes, on the left, was among the group that raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi and was captured forever in Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph. Half of those in the picture were killed before the day was over. Hayes made it through the war, but couldn't survive the photograph.
Ira was wined and dined as a hero, and his story, of course, as many people know, he was found dead out on the reservation in 1955. Alcohol problems and exposure to the elements, and it reminds me of something that F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote. He said, "You show me a hero and I'll write you a tragedy."
Ira Hayes was thrown into the limelight, but the wartime heroics of certain Navajo servicemen were very carefully kept secret, for they developed a secret code based on the Navajo language. Our troops could then communicate openly on their radios with the help of the Navajo code talkers. The Japanese never figured it out. In Phoenix, their deeds are memorialized by a sculpture of a Navajo holding a native flute. Back on the home front, Arizonans were playing host to some accidental tourists. Christmas of 1944 saw the escape of 25 German POWs from the camp at Papago Park near Phoenix. They were all captured, but some had an ingenious plan. They made a boat and were going to sail it down the Salt River to Mexico. After all, the map said there was a river there. And there were other POWs, as the government ordered that all Japanese Americans be removed from the Pacific coastal region. They were forced to live at internment camps, the largest of which, numbering 18,000 residents, was at Sacaton in Pinal County. In the process, these loyal American citizens lost businesses and property, but retained their loyalty and dignity. Many of the young men enlisted and fought well for their country, the country that imprisoned their own families. 40 years later, the U.S. Congress officially apologized for this violation of their rights. During the war years, Arizona had a determined and courageous governor. From a pioneer family, Democrat Sidney P. Osborne was viewed as a political boy wonder. At 26, the youngest delegate to the Constitutional Convention. At 27, elected Secretary of State, serving 3 terms. But in 1918, things changed. He lost the gubernatorial primary, tried again and lost in 1924. He suffered a personal tragedy when his wife died, though he later remarried. Osborne worked at a variety of businesses with no great success. He became a journalist. Back in politics, he lost a U.S. Senate race in 1934. Viewed as a perennial candidate, he was often the butt of jokes. Finally, in 1940, one last time, Sid Osborne ran for governor and won. He had great command of the office, an open door to the press. Arizona finally signed the Colorado River Compact. He fought for civil rights and personally mediated labor disputes. He was elected governor and re-elected 3 more times. In his 4th term, he was stricken with what today we would call Lou Gehrig's disease. Paralyzed and speechless, Osborne continued to carry out his duties with the help of his wife Gladys. On May 24, 1948, Governor Sidney P. Osborne died in office, a symbol of the determination that is so much a part of the spirit of Arizona. In the United States of the early 1950s, we were discovering 2 things, appliances and credit. The consumer age had begun, and in Arizona, the key word was explosion.
How'd you do, how'd you do, how'd you do? How'd you do, how'd you do, how'd you do?
It was not uncommon in Phoenix in the early 50s to look north at the pre-dawn sky and watch with the naked eye the burst of atomic bombs at the Nevada test site. It seemed symbolic of what was happening in Arizona. Tucson and Phoenix just didn't know what was coming.
Most of the streets needed paving when the, not any of the principal streets, but a lot of the feeding streets were definitely dirt, and they, when the wind blew, there was a lot of real estate in the air. I remember that.
And what I saw was this, that this was the place that was going to grow. And the reason was that the veterans, like myself, who were looking for a place to establish themselves, this was a natural. First of all, those who had trained here at Luke and at Williams, they came back. Those of us who by happenstance came, we stayed.
That was an era when communities took pride in announcing that they had doubled their population again. One veteran built a little house for his wife Mary, but they sold it instead. Ultimately, John F. Long built some 40,000 homes, and although he was the largest, he was one of many in a very competitive market.
Ours were around 1,300 square feet, two bath, large lots, 7,000, 7,500.
Of course, the population boom would have ended with the 1st August had we not first developed the evaporative cooler.
At the very beginning, it was just an experiment. And one of my neighbors put a whole bunch of rocks and had the fan blow through the rocks with water dripping over it. It didn't prove very successful. The Excelsior was the best deal. It took some of the moisture out.
Hard to put it on the roof if it was full of rocks.
But everybody made them. They were homemade for the most part.
It was at this time that Arizonans were fighting in the Korean War. On the home front, it was not uncommon to see training squadrons of jet fighters flying from Luke, Williams, and Davis Mountain Air Base. The population had grown to 750,000. It would increase 74% to 1.3 million by 1960. Democrat Secretary of State Dan Garvey had finished out the term of the late Sid Osborne, and in 1948 was elected governor in his own right. But the great influx of Midwesterners also brought something called Republicans. In 1950, popular radio broadcaster and war correspondent Howard Pyle became the first Republican governor in 20 years. The same general election gave the state its first black legislators, Representatives Carl Sims and H.B. Daniels. It would be another 20 years before Clovis Campbell became our first black state senator. In 1953, we saw another breakthrough for black citizens. In Superior Court, Judge Fred Struckmeyer wrote, "A half-century of intolerance is enough." He ordered the desegregation of the Phoenix Union High School district. The all-black George Washington Carver High School was closed. This preceded by a full year the similar U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education.
Fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you if you're young at heart.
There was another first for Arizona during that post-war period, 1949 to be exact. It was called television. The inaugural broadcast came over Channel 5, KPHO in Phoenix. Soon to follow were KTYL, KOOL, KTVK in Phoenix, and in Tucson, KOLD. If you don't recognize a few of these, it's because some of the names have been changed over the years. Howdy Doody was the national phenomenon, and local television was quick to follow. In Phoenix, it was Lou King's first Federal Ranger show. A regular act on that program was the Rascals in Rhythm with Jerry and his little brother, Wayne Newton. Another lasting face was 9-year-old announcer Gary Peter Klahr.
TV in those days, we take it for granted. We have so many channels. In those days, when you were on TV, there was one channel, remember, for several years, only here, Channel 5, where we were on, obviously. We had 100% rating, in effect. I mean, all TV sets were on, and all TV sets were watching us. That tells it all.
Think it would pop.
Wallace and Ladmo. Many local programs came and went over the years, but none has had the impact of KPHO's Wallace and Ladmo. First aired in 1954, this supposed kids' cartoon show featured sophisticated social satire.
Not deferential enough to men. What does that mean?
How should I know, you fat fool?
And I watched them every day. And even when I grew up and I was supposed to be too old to watch them, I still watched them because they were very hip. They always kept abreast of the times, and they were very hip. They were the Saturday Night Live before Saturday Night Live. They were the Second City before the Second City. That's right. You know, and these guys were inventive and original.
The Wallace and Ladmo shows also won 6 Emmys, and to this day, no one knows why. I hate hippies.
On December 29, 1989, after 35 and a half years and nearly 10,000 shows, Bill Thompson's Wallace and Vladimir Kwiatkowski's Ladmo said goodbye for the last time. The nation's longest-running same-cast program came to an end, as did an era of television.
You haven't just been Mr. Wallace. You've been like a brother to me. Great big fat older brother.
Meanwhile, back in politics, 1954 brought Ernest W. McFarland to the governor's office. Mac, as he was called, had served 12 years in the United States Senate. As governor, he began the first state government efforts to attract the electronics industry. Later, Ernest McFarland served as Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court. Paul Fannin, who later was a United States Senator, recaptured the governor's chair for the Republicans in 1958. During his 6-year administration, there was established Arizona's community college system, which today provides low-cost higher education to more than 150,000 students each year. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy came to town to celebrate Carl Hayden's 50 years in Congress. Talking with civic leader Tom Chauncey, Kennedy reportedly said he had only one complaint about Arizona, that back in the 1940s he hadn't bought the cheap land he'd been offered in Paradise Valley. In the 1960s, the Republican cities had the population, but the rural Democrats had the power. Those in power knew they'd have to redesign the legislature so that every citizen would have equal representation, but they were in no hurry until the appearance of a young man whom we had last seen on the Lou King Ranger television show. Law student Gary Peter Klahr filed and won a federal class action suit to implement one man, one vote.
All the respected political leaders in the state say that to avoid disruption and controversy, that they would wait, a couple years before they did anything about it. And I said, to hell with that. I mean, this, everywhere else in the world, we're doing it. It's being done in the United States. Why should Arizona be 50th in that as well as everything else?
I was more vocal than most, and they resented it because the change in power took place. If you can imagine that from 1912 to 1966, it was dominated strictly from rural counties. Then all of a sudden, all the power left them.
Well, despite this fundamental change, the Democrats took back the governor's office in 1964 with the election of Sam Goddard from Tucson. He was the state chairman of the party at the time. During Goddard's term, one of his highest priorities was the implementation of an executive budgeting system for state government. In the second half of this century, the major political story in Arizona is called Barry Goldwater. He was born in Arizona Territory in 1909 to a prominent pioneer family. Characterizing Barry Goldwater's early years parallels the spirit of Arizona itself. No limit to the possibilities, confident, maybe a bit cocky, like a teenager jumping into the ring with a prize fighter.
Barry decided, he said, here, I want to get in there. And so Barry got up, and the very first thing Barry did was put a haymaker right before he hardly got started, and this fellow just tore Barry apart, just beat the devil out of him.
The operator of a successful family business, Goldwater spent leisure time exploring Arizona and becoming a world-renowned photographer. He was also a champion golfer and a pilot in the Air Force Reserve. He retired a brigadier general. In 1949, at age 40, he entered politics, first on the Phoenix City Council, then in 1952 riding the Eisenhower coattails to the United States Senate.
He's candid. Now, I don't think Barry's ever been accused of being a diplomat. But he called him the way he saw him.
And Goldwater, in my judgment, never, ever altered in all his years from those basic principles. You never had to like him, because he'll tell you how it is.
In 1964, Barry Goldwater became the Republican nominee for President of the United States.
The '64 campaign had great enthusiasm and a very definite pride to it. You were proud to be associated with Goldwater because a certain amount of that integrity we hoped would reflect on us. And yet, those of us that were realists knew that down the line there on some Tuesday in November, the Ador was going to cool quite a lot. I didn't think it would be the massacre that it was.
I don't care where you are. Young people who've now become old people, they believe that he, more than anybody else, was true to his convictions. So, all I can tell you is this: Barry Goldwater's place in history is assured forever.
And he's probably the kind of person this state will never see again.
Oh, the times they are a-changin'.
Christmas season of 1969, Frank Borman and his crew went to the moon and circled it and came home. This preceded the landing several missions later.
When astronaut Frank Borman of Tucson led the Apollo 8 mission, it was symbolic of Arizona's important role in the space program. Scores of high-tech firms developed, changing forever the face of organized labor.
Oh, the times they are a-changin'.
And all of a sudden, again, the demographics simply eliminated the power of organized labor. All of a sudden, we were living in a state in which the vast majority of the people neither belonged to labor unions nor had any particular sympathy for the labor cause.
The late 60s and early 70s brought another significant change during the administration of Governor Jack Williams.
And that legislature was referred to as the gung-ho legislature, completely reformed the entire government of Arizona. Instead of the former, almost territorial form of government, set up departments, made all sorts of tremendously dramatic changes, most of which I don't agree with anymore, but we put in civil service. We did everything wrong, but never has there been such a change in a government accomplished by an administration as during that particular time in history.
There were other areas that needed reform as well. Raul Castro reflects on the impact of his experiences as a teenager.
And yet to be told at a YMCA that you can't swim with the rest of your classmates because you're of Mexican background, you can only swim on Saturday when the water's dirty, you've already emptied the water on that particular day. That is the thing that has motivated me all my life and made me feel that these things are wrong. Something happens, they have to be corrected. And this is sort of been my mission most of my life. So therefore, these and many of the kids, this is the origin of civil rights. This was created and started civil rights.
With Hispanics comprising 17% and blacks only 5% of our population, the fight for civil rights has been long and is ongoing. Young Raul Castro set his sights high. Born in Mexico, raised in poverty, he struggled against the odds. He became a lawyer, a judge, an ambassador, and governor of Arizona.
So that is a confirmation to me to the young people that really the opportunity is there. The public will support you. If you're able to do a fairly decent job and they're satisfied that you're a decent man, I think they'll support you. And to me, this has been the confirmation. I think it's, I repeat, to me, this is the greatest country in the world.
Raul Castro, a keeper of the spirit of Arizona.
There's something happening here. What it is.
The Vietnam War impacted Arizona as it did the rest of the nation. Over the years, there was a growing anti-war movement. There were protests, but perhaps not as vociferous as in some other places. Arizonans served gallantly in Southeast Asia. 6 were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor: Oscar Austin, Jose F. Jimenez, Billy Loeffler, Jay Vargas, Nicky Bacon, and Fred Ferguson. By the 1960s, the face of Arizona was changing. Quite literally, businesses with 30, 50, 75-year histories, names the state had grown up with, were disappearing. Department stores like Corkran became Broadway, Diamonds became Dillard's, and Blakely's Gas became Gulf, to cite a few. But there were some new business phenomena as well. The most amazing was Del Webb's Sun City.
We met at the restaurant, and we were told by the Del Webb people that this was the greatest thing since shirt pockets. And I thought to myself, along with all the other press corps, this is the silliest thing I've ever, it's not going to amount to anything, it's going to die on the vine. And how wrong we were.
The 1970s and 1980s in Arizona are not so much history as they are recent events. It's hard to say which will be historically significant. In some cases, the final chapters haven't been written yet. In others, the wounds haven't healed. But let's take these last few minutes and remember some of the things that have made news and controversy during the past decade or so. One of our water wars got settled with the construction of the Central Arizona Project Canal. Atomic energy came to Arizona from the Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station. The University of Arizona got the state's first medical school and teaching hospital. Mo Udall ran for president, came in second to Jimmy Carter 7 times. Raul Castro became ambassador to Argentina, so longtime Secretary of State Wesley Bolin became governor. A few months later, Wes Bolin died. The governor's chair passed to Bruce Babbitt, who ramrodded adoption of a groundwater code and created a Department of Environmental Quality. Sandra O'Connor brought pride to Arizona when she became the first woman appointed to the United States Supreme Court. And not to forget another Arizonan, William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. A word about arts and entertainment. Arizona has seen an explosion in the area of community and professional theater, symphonies, opera, and ballet. And of course, Arizona now has professional sports with the Phoenix Suns basketball team and the NFL football Cardinals. Back in politics, Bruce Babbitt became the 3rd Arizonan to make a serious bid for the White House. He didn't win, but he won the respect of the nation. In 1986, auto dealer Evan Meekum became the 17th person to hold the office of governor of Arizona. A year and a half later, he became the first to be impeached and removed from office. The arguments will continue for years. But on a more peaceful front, Arizona had history-making visits from Pope John Paul II and from Mother Teresa. And let's not forget young Rosie Perica from up in Globe. She was a gifted player on the ball diamond and turned down an offer at professional basketball. She chose instead to work for the people, and with the true spirit of Arizona, where an individual can go as far as their hard work and talent will take them, Rosie Perica, or Rose Mofford, did go on to serve the people as our 18th and first woman governor. Rose Mofford, a testament to the spirit of Arizona.
It's yesterday once more.
Rose Mofford certainly deserves credit for restoring calm to a turbulent Arizona political scene. I have a list of nearly 65 names of other people who should be included in a program like this, but time just does not permit, and for that I am sorry. But it serves as a reminder that Arizona's historical pockets are deep. When I was a kid in Arizona, I thought all the history happened someplace else and a long time ago. But now I know that some of the most exciting stories happen right here. And when you have people who live with the spirit of Arizona, they're making history almost every day. As always, I would encourage you to explore Arizona history on your own, at the library, the bookstore, and I hope on television. Remember, history is never out of date. And finally this, the spirit of Arizona is something that is within each of us. It's the courage to follow a dream, the willingness to work hard, and the determination to never give up. That's the spirit. That's an Arizonan. I'm Bill McCune. Take care. What's an Arizonan?
I think this is still valid. Arizona, from the beginning, was the land of the second chance.
Arizona is about freedom, initiative, mobility, independence, newcomers, and the future.
Down through the years, we've seen people who have come out here for one reason or another, some to get something, some to get away from something, and I think that overall they have had something to give.
What you might call a pioneer spirit, and those who were looking for a new way of life and maybe opportunities that they couldn't see and wherever they came from.
Number one, an Arizonan has an air of independence about him. He wants to be independent. He doesn't like to be dictated upon. An Arizonan is very much concerned with his neighbors, concerned with people. He has a deep concern, and he loves his state. He wants to do everything in the world to make it a better state.
You know the old saying that the coward stayed home and the weak died on the way. So the residue are these strong and heroic figures that we like to think that we are.